G'day folks, and welcome to this game comparison of War for the Ring, Star Wars Rebellion, and Dune War for Arrakis. These are three amazing, thematic, cinematic, epic games, all with kind of very similar feel. I really want to break this down, talk about all three games, talk about why you might like one over the other. As with my other game comparisons, I do want to emphasize from the start, this is about celebrating these games, highlighting their points of difference, how they feel different. It is not about saying one is better than the other or putting one down over the other. Okay, so the basics. First of all, these are advertised as principally 2 to 4 player games, but they all play best with 2 players. Dune does have an official solitaire version. There is an unofficial, I think, player-made solitaire variant for Star Wars Rebellion, and I'm not aware of any solitaire variant for War of the Ring, but please let me know if I'm wrong. I will be contrasting the base games only. There are expansions for Dune, there are expansions for War of the Ring, there is an expansion for Star Wars Rebellion. But I will point out from the start that I consider the Star Wars Rebellion expansion called Rise of the Empire to be the most essential expansion out of all of these for all three games. If you've got a copy of Star Wars Rebellion, I highly recommend the Rise of the Empire expansion. It really adds a lot, and it's the only expansion that I'll talk about in this comparison because it's really a mechanical upgrade, enhancement. I think it just takes some of the core elements of the base game and enhances them. It actually changes the core mechanics a little bit. For Dune and for War of the Ring, the expansions add new content. They add new miniatures, they add new rules, they add new environments, they add new things. The Rise of the Empire is really a mechanical change to the base game. So I consider that almost, we'll never play the base game of Star Wars Rebellion again. We'll always play with the Rise of the Empire. So I highly recommend the Rise of the Empire expansion. It adds, it's described as cinematic combat. It adds a new way to use combat cards, leader rerolls. It's subtle, but it makes the combat in Star Wars Rebellion a lot of fun. And again, I'll come back to that in a moment in the comparison. So, War of the Ring was first published. The first edition came out in 2004. It's designed by Roberto Di Meglio, Marco Maggi, and Francesco Nepitello. The second edition, though, which is probably the most popular edition, was published in 2011. Okay, and this was published by Ares Games. Now, Star Wars Rebellion was first published in 2016. It was designed by Corey Koenigsegger, and it was published by Fantasy Flight Games. Again, epic, cinematic, flavorful, thematic, focus on sort of the Star Wars universe. And Dune, War for Arrakis, was only published this year, 2024. And again, the designer was Marco Maggi and Francesco Nepitello, and it was published by Simon Global Limited. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is gameplay and get kind of a sense of what these games are like to play. And again, the reason I'm comparing these is because they are all epic, flavorful, thematic, cinematic games tied to these sort of franchises, popular culture elements. Lord of the Rings for War of the Ring, Dune for Dune War for Arrakis, and of course the Star Wars movie franchises for Star Wars Rebellion. Gameplay so two of them have a common mechanical element, and that is that in War of the Ring and Dune War for Arrakis, both players will roll. Again, I'm going to focus on the 2-player game. I'm not going to talk about the 3 or the 4-player game because I've never played any of these games with 3 or 4 players. So, in War of the Ring and Dune War for Arrakis, both players will have a set of dice they roll each turn, and the results on these dice determine the actions they can take. So they are dice-driven activations. Key here is that both games have asymmetrical player powers. So in War of the Ring, the Shadow player has many more dice than the Free People's player. Likewise, in Dune War for Arrakis, the Harkonnen player has many more dice and thus activations than the Atreides player. So it's a very similar feel there. This also creates a similar dynamic between the two players. One has large armies, has the power in a sense, has sort of this freedom of movement around the map, large forces. They also, I'll talk about this in a moment, but they also have many more forces on the board. And yeah, they're kind of big hitting. Whereas both the Free People's player in War of the Ring and the Atreides player in Dune War for Arrakis are kind of the underdogs. They are almost engaging in this kind of guerrilla warfare, hit and run, or kind of taking opportunities to attack. I can say that about both games. They look for these little opportunities or openings where they can counterattack at times, in the right environment, at the right time, with the right forces disposition when they see a weakness in either the Shadow player or the Harkonnen player. So they're both very similar in that sense. In one key difference, in War of the Ring, if the Free People's player has fewer dice left than the Shadow player, they can pass. Okay, so pass the initiative. If they don't want to go, they want to see what the Shadow player will do, they can pass. In Dune, War for Arrakis, they've kind of enhanced this mechanic. Instead of just passing, you take what's called a desert action, and this is playing worm sign tokens, these could be possible sandworms. They also enhance them. Those tokens also enhance the movement capabilities of Atreides forces. You can move sandworms that have been revealed around the map, so you actually control these sandworms, or you can attack with a sandworm, and they can attack, Harkonnen forces. So this kind of they're relatively small, quick actions, not involving kind of your main military forces. But when the sandworms attack, they can do some damage. So it gives you something to do rather than just passing as you do in War of the Ring. Now, Star Wars Rebellion is a bit of a contrast to this. Gameplay mainly revolves around leader activations, and you will allocate leaders to missions to try and achieve missions to advance your steps towards victory or dominance of the galaxy, or you will use these leaders to activate spaces for kind of movement and combat. So you've got the Rebel Alliance versus the Empire, doing this back and forth with their leaders. So leaders are central to pretty much activations. So you've got two of these games rely on dice activations, and you'll spend a dice to activate, to do something basically. Each dice face has a different type of action. It might be drawing a card, or playing a card, or recruiting new forces in various ways, or moving those forces, or moving to attack, things like that. In Star Wars, you are either trying to perform a mission, or activating and moving spaces for either just movement or for combat. That's the core of the gameplay. Okay, Star Wars is quite distinct from Dune, War for Arrakis, and War of the Ring. In terms of complexity, I would say they are all very much the same. There is very little to distinguish these in terms of learning the game or probably depth of gameplay. They're all different in the way that you are pursuing victory. Look, all things considered, all the kind of politics and war and combat and movement and special thematic rules, I would say they are all very similar. So one is not substantially more or less complex than the other. I'd say the same thing about length as well. They all average, with some experience, about 3 hours. I would probably say your first game of War of the Ring would probably be longer because of probably just the more epic scope. There's more to look at. There's more to wrap your head around. But experienced players, once you've played 3 games of each game, I would say they all play fairly closely to about, if not a little under 3 hours. If anything, Dune is probably the fastest playing of the 3, but not a lot of difference is the main message here. They're all very similar complexity, all very similar length. And I'd say the same about replayability. And again, I'm only contrasting the base games here, but I'd say that they all have much the same levels of replayability in the base game. If I really, really, really had to divide them by replayability, I'd probably say Star Wars Rebellion is the most replayable because of the variable setup and the hidden location at the Rebel base. It can create very different gaming experiences. Okay, the Rebel base could be here, way on the left in one game, and that creates a narrative. The next game could be out on the right, and it creates a different narrative. That's a defining feature which enhances replayability. Then I'd probably say, look, Dune and War of the Ring, pretty close. Dune does have variable setup. You will set up your, I forget what they're called, your Atreides bases. They have a name, and they have different strength from 1 to 3. And so ideally, the Atreides player will want to defend their bases with the strength of 3. Sieges, they're called sieges. So you'll defend your siege, they'll have a strength from 1 to 3. So it's more important for you to defend your siege that's worth 3 because it's got a defensive 3, and it also is worth 3 victory points for the Harkonnen player. So they are set up variably. You'll also have variable starting deployment tokens, whereas War of the Ring always sets up exactly the same. So yeah, look, maybe putting Dune above War of the Ring in terms of that variable setup, different gaming experience. Yeah, maybe marginally though. Okay, that's in terms of replay. But I mean, they're all very, very replayable games. I still play War of the Ring is the most played of all 3, and yeah, I still love to return to it. So they are all very, very, very replayable. Okay, so I want to talk now about sort of missions or short-term objectives, and I'll start with Star Wars Rebellion because really the missions are key to victory in Star Wars Rebellion, or they're key to a lot of what you're doing. You will allocate leaders to missions, and then on your turn, when you activate this leader, you'll try to achieve the mission. Sometimes it's automatic success, and it will change the game state. Sometimes there'll be a contest, so you'll have basically a roll-off versus your opponent, but basically you are striving for these missions. You're trying to achieve these missions or pursuing these missions as a path to victory, ultimately. It can change the loyalty of star systems. It can maybe recruit new forces. So missions are pretty critical in Star Wars. It is quite abstracted. You are selecting the leaders that you feel are best equipped based on their attributes to succeed in that mission. And yeah, just allocating them to a mission card to achieve the mission. Dune, it kind of takes that idea, but gives you actually specific objectives to achieve. So it might be, take Paul and put him out in a desert space by himself or something. It might be have Atreides forces in 3 mountain regions. So you've actually got to do something to achieve these missions. It might be have your smuggler character in a sector without any Harkonnen forces. Okay, so things like this. So the difference is, in Dune, the missions are public. They are known to both the Atreides player and the Harkonnen player. So the Harkonnen player will know what these missions are. And if you start moving Atreides forces into the mountains, or if you start moving Paul out into these desert spaces, the Harkonnen player will kind of know that you are pursuing these missions and can respond to that. They can move to counter, they can attack you in the mountains. So it's really interesting. The missions are public, but because of the tension in these dice activations, the Harkonnen player may have their own objectives, they may have their own things they want to do, and they may just ignore you and let you do your missions. Now the missions, it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic. In Dune, 3 missions are revealed each turn, and they give you the rewards for achieving these missions are advancing prescience markers on the boards. And think of these as your victory point markers. The Atreides player has a secret objective at the start of the game, and it might be 4 red, 6 green, 9 yellow. And that is what they need to win the game. So achieving a certain mission might give them 1 red, 1 green, and they bump those little tokens up. Now, ultimately, the Harkonnen player doesn't know what the Atreides player is trying to achieve in terms of their secret objective. They just know that they're trying to achieve missions, trying to advance these prescience markers, these tokens, and they're trying to stop them as much as possible. Now, this kind of is a common theme across these games. You can't do everything. You can't defend everywhere. He who defends everywhere defends nothing. And so in Star Wars sort of Rebellion, you've got to kind of hold you can't do everything. You can't do every mission. You've got to hold your leaders back. In Dune, the Atreides player can't pursue every. With only 4 dice they can use, 4 actions they can use on a turn. They can't do everything. They need to think about what is the most efficient use of their time. And likewise, the Harkonnen player is thinking, well, what do I want to counter? Do I really want to spend 3 actions moving an army out to stop Paul being in the desert? Or do I want to spend 1 action, attacking this Atreides force instead? It's a similar story with War of the Ring. There are no missions, but there are short-term objectives, short-term goals that you are personally striving for. And this is really about, okay, as a Sauron player, over the next turn or 2, I want to capture Helm's Deep. And this is sort of a personal objective that you're setting for yourself. There's no mission card. There's no objective board or card that you are striving for. It's like, okay, this is what I want to do. And you move your forces to achieve that. You are more focused on those victory points, those goals, rather than any actual thematic mission or card. But the goals that you're setting for yourself reflect the story, reflect the theme. Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, things like that. So yeah, there's quite distinct differences in the way the short-term goals, objectives, and missions are presented, but they all find ways to draw upon the theme of Star Wars, because in Star Wars it could be destroy the Death Star or secure an alliance, and you're doing that, and you are destroying the Death Star, literally a miniature on the map. In Dune, it could be Paul is out in the desert talking with people, or I know the least about the Dune universe, but it's he's out in the desert talking with the Fremen. And in War of the Ring, you capture the Sauron player Isengard captures Helm's Deep, or doesn't. There's a big defense, big fight around Helm's Deep. So yeah, different ways that those short-term goals, that the story is advanced in a way. Okay, let's move on to talk about thematic tension. Okay, I want to talk about the way that these missions and the other elements make the game exciting. So in Star Wars Rebellion, the rebels, the Empire is basically trying to destroy the Rebel Alliance and find the Rebel base. If the Imperials find the Rebel base and destroy Rebel defenses, they win. The Rebels are trying to stop that. They're trying to slow the Alliance down. It almost feels like they're on the back foot, slowing them down as much as possible. They are desperately trying to achieve as many missions as possible. They can, this is basically a timer, okay? They've got their reputation, I think it starts on 14, and then the turn track starts at 0. Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. And whenever they achieve certain missions, they reduce their reputation, I think the way it works. And when these two meet, the Rebel player wins. So the Rebel player is in a race to kind of enhance their reputation or move this track down as they advance the turn marker. At some point they'll inevitably overlap, and they need to do that before the Imperial player has found the Rebel base and destroyed Rebel defenses. So it is really a race against time. The Rebels need to achieve these missions as quickly as possible. At the same time, they are trying to secure the loyalty of the galaxy. They need to maintain their forces. They need to do as much as they can with their military forces to slow down the Empire. And there is definitely this sense of they're falling back, they're being battered, they're striving to sort of achieve enough mission success just to eke out a victory before being overwhelmed by these massive Imperial forces. In War of the Ring, similar story. The forces of Sauron are overwhelming, and there are so many of them, and they are endless. When Sauron forces are destroyed, they can be rebuilt. The Free People's player have limited forces. Once an elf dies, it's out of the game, and so they can't be rebuilt. So it's a similar story. But in War of the Ring, of course, the Fellowship is trying to get the ring into Mordor whilst manage corruption. So they are on this journey. And then you're advancing the Fellowship and complementing the Fellowship and managing corruption and trying to influence Free People's cities around the board. And it's a race against time. It is a race to get the ring to Mordor before the forces of Sauron can overwhelm Middle-earth, much in the same kind of trajectory with Star Wars Rebellion. Dune does, again, much the same thing. I've mentioned their secret objective for the game. Right? They are trying to achieve these missions, which gives them prescience marker. They're called prescience markers, but basically they're red, yellow, and green. So you're trying to achieve a mission which will advance your red and green markers to the point that you need to achieve your mission, your secret objective for the game before the Harkonnen forces can destroy you. Okay, so I should have mentioned in War of the Ring, I believe I think it's the Shadow player, Sauron player needs, I think it's 10 or 12 victory points. Okay, so they're trying to destroy free people's strongholds and cities to gain those victory points. And it's a similar story in Dune War for Arrakis. The Harkonnen player is trying to get 10 victory points. And this difference between, in War of the Ring, the Shadow player has to wait till the end of the turn to win. In Dune, the Harkonnen player wins the moment they hit 10. So the instant they capture that last, I've forgotten the name of the place again, the last siege, and get 10 victory points or more. 10, they're not called victory points, they're called supremacy points or more, they win the game. Okay, so the Atreides player is trying to do their missions. They are trying to achieve these little goals and get these coloured tokens, prescience markers, up the track to meet the conditions required on their secret objective for the game before the Harkonnen player can destroy all their sieges and get enough victory points. So again, all three games have this similar race against time mechanism where the weaker military force, the Rebel Alliance, the Free Peoples, the Atreides, are trying to achieve their mission, their objective. Reputation meets time. The ring has been dropped into Mordor, or your prescience tokens have met your secret objective before they are overwhelmed by this great military force. So all have that same kind of core trajectory in common, and they all do it brilliantly. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other. They're all fascinating. They're all immensely thematic. They all create the same type of tension. Both players are really racing against time. It's not just a race for the underdog. The Harkonnen, the Empire, and the Shadow player, the Sauron forces. They are in a race against time before the underdog can meet their objective. So they need to bring their military forces and attack, and be really careful with their force strengths and dispositions and so forth. In all three games, I want to talk about maps. In all three games, the thematic maps and the engaging maps and the clarity of these maps and the diversity of the environments on these maps and the scale of these maps as well, because they are huge. That is all. The maps are central to the theme and the tension. Okay, and I want to talk maps as a core element of gameplay. In Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship is moving through Middle-earth, and you are navigating, locations. It's difficult to move through enemy forces. You've got the Nazgul moving around, so you want to avoid the Nazgul. You want to rest and recover and recuperate in free people's strongholds, so you'll try to move to those. And you're managing these large military forces around this map. And I'd argue that of all three games, War of the Ring has the greatest sense of grandeur in its map. The map of Middle-earth is huge, and it covers so much of this environment. And it's very thematic, and the various event cards that come into play refer to these locations. So your attention is really drawn all over the map, and military campaigns can be waged all over this map. Now, Star Wars Rebellion it's difficult to create a thematic map of the galaxy, but they do it really well, and you get to know these star systems and the planets, and because of the stories, you become connected to certain areas, and stories are told on Hoth and Endor and things like this. So the planets themselves have a thematic connection, and you become attached to them, and you also, I'll talk about it in a moment, but you track the loyalty of these star systems, and they can also become subjugated by the Empire. So there's this kind of little mini stories happening as well. Mostly the story told in Star Wars Rebellion is the story of the military forces. So yes, you've got these missions going on, but you're always looking at military forces on the map and disposition of forces and the Death Star moving along, and all this kind of stuff. That is, I think, where a large part of that tension lies. Okay, well, the visible tension at least. You can see the force of the Empire moving in a certain direction. You can see them poised to strike between two planets, and you can't defend them both. So what are you going to do? Things like that. So yeah, the map facilitates that tension. And it's the same in Dune, Wolf Arrakis. You've got this bleak desert landscape, the mountain regions, and various Seiches and what are they called? They're called as Arakeen, Pion villages, and Carthage set up. And consideration of the terrain is really important in Dune. I mentioned that the Atreides player can place the worm sign tokens. Now these are sort of tremors. They are signs that there may be a worm in the area, and the Atreides player can use these to basically worm ride across the map. And they can cover vast areas of the map if they have these worm sign tokens connected together. So yeah, that all happens on the map. You're looking at the map, you're looking at desert spaces connected, you're looking at these worm sign tokens, and you're moving across the map. You've also got the map is divided into sectors, and the Harkonnen player can use their vehicles. So the Harkonnen player gets special vehicles. They use their ornithopters to place them on the boundary of a sector to be able to transport their units 2 spaces away. So it's not quite as they don't get the vast worm riding movement of the Atreides player, but it is more versatile because they don't need to place worm sign tokens down. If they have an ornithopter in a space, the Atreides player can see that ornithopter and they know there's this rapid movement available. They can move 2 spaces away. It's not huge, but if they place a large Harkonnen force smack bang in the middle of the sector, it covers most of the spaces in that sector, and if there's an ornithopter there, they'll be jumping down on something in that sector. So that creates a tension as well. Both a combination of the map itself, the map layout, the use of sectors to divide the map into little areas, the use of vehicles, and the worm sign tokens creates that on-map tension. You're looking at the map, you're looking at the possibilities available, what can happen. And worms have a similar effect as well. Worms can attack up to 2 spaces away. So when there is a sandworm on the map, the Harkonnen forces need to be careful as well, because I can move a sandworm to within 2 spaces of, let's say, 2 of their forces, and they're thinking, okay, what force is going to be attacked? So yeah, there's that on-map tension. But all this, the map also recreates the theme. Okay, all 3 maps, Dune, Star Wars, War of the Ring, they're immensely thematic, and they capture that environment and the feeling, the miniatures, all these things as well. So tied in with that, I want to talk briefly about thematic elements. All 3 titles have characters from the stories, the movies, the books, leaders with leader special abilities and attributes. And I won't go into detail about all these, but it's really hard to divide and say one is better than the other. They do it maybe slightly differently. I think, I won't say one's better than the other. I think War of the Ring does it best. War of the Ring certainly connects you to the characters best. When Aragorn is leading a Gondor army in Minas Tirith, it's really thematic, and when Frodo is, you know where these characters are, and you know what they're doing, and they all have their special little abilities that they're using quite powerfully. In Star Wars Rebellion, I'd probably say the importance of the characters is the weakest of the 3. You're just allocating these characters to missions. They are important, but mainly for their attributes, what they bring to a mission, rather than, that they're important people, but there's nothing particularly special about them aside from their attributes. They might have leader characteristics, which is important, but yeah, there's nothing to say that person did something really special, okay? Dune is somewhere in between. All the characters have special abilities, but and they bring in special ability cards, which enhances your actions. So yes, it's great to have, I keep forgetting all the names of all the other characters, but let's say Paul, or let's say Stilgar. Okay, so Stilgar is, combat veteran. He brings, he brings a lot to combat when he's involved in combat, which our traders people generally don't want to be involved in combat because they're the underdog. He also brings a special bonus to one of the action dice. Okay, it's reflected on a card. So yeah, there's that theme there, but for the most part, it's a very small bonus. So yeah, I think War of the Ring does his best. I said I wouldn't rank, but here I am ranking. Well, I think War of the Ring does the character immersion best, and then Dune, and then Star Wars Rebellion, if that's important for you. But all three have that, those leaders. In all three games, the miniatures are amazing. I would say that I've played War of the Ring many times now, but my first few plays of War of the Ring, it was confusing. You're often mixing up elves and the humans. Until you paint these miniatures, if you're using the unpainted miniatures, yeah, it can be confusing at times you often get them mixed up and so forth. Star Wars Rebellion is pretty clear. There are quite distinct unit types, but I think the Dune has the clearest miniatures because they use different base sizes. So round bases for your regular units, square bases for your elite units, and hexagonal bases for your special elites. The Harkonnen forces have what are called Saduka, and the Atreides player have the Fedaykin. But yeah, they're very, very clear, very easy to distinguish. Hexagonal, square, circular bases, and quite distinct leader units. Very, very easy to distinguish. Okay, in terms of so whilst Dune has the most distinct leaders, it has the least amount of flavour, art, and text. I think War of the Ring has the best. And it's interesting because Dune and War of the Ring, same designers, but War of the Ring has the best flavour immersion through text and art and events. Okay, there's art everywhere and it's beautiful, and the events in the game, the cards that you play are thematic. Dune, however, is relatively light on that theme and story. The planning cards, so you have these planning cards, and they're very minimalist. Text only, bare bones text. You'll have an event title, okay, which connects you to the story, but that's pretty much it. Dune really relies on the map to tell the story. Star Wars is probably again somewhere in between. Yes, you've got. Actually, I put it probably close alongside War of the Ring in terms of the cards and the images being very immersive. Certainly much better than Dune, so really high up there. You've got Destroy the Death Star or things like that happening. That's all I can think of at the moment. But yeah, it connects you with the people, the events, the stories of the Star Wars universe. Okay, so I've moved on to victory now, and I've touched on victory before. In War of the Ring, there's one path to victory, which is capturing enemy settlements, and the Free People's player doesn't need to capture much, but it's very hard for them to wage war, and ultimately the Shadow player is trying to do that. Or the other path of victory is the ring. Free People's player can get the ring to Mordor to instantly win. The Shadow player can corrupt the ring bearers to win. In Dune, as I said, the Harkonnen player is trying to get to 10 supremacy points by capturing sieges. Or the Atreides player wins by meeting the red, yellow, green prescience conditions on their secret objective card. In Star Wars Rebellion, as I said, the Empire is trying to find and destroy the Rebel base. The Rebel players are trying to get their reputation and the time marker in the same space. Okay, I want to briefly talk about some of the other elements. So force management, I mentioned that the map is critical. All three games feature asymmetric player powers, a strong military force and a weak underdog engaging almost in guerrilla warfare and missions of a sort. In War of the Ring and Star Wars Rebellions, you're moving these large forces around, and often multiple large forces. Dune is more diverse. Atreides certainly have more groups of smaller forces spread all around the board, whereas the Harkonnen they might only have one, two, or three large armies active at a time. And obviously, the way you approach the game will vary, but yeah, large, hard-hitting armies. one distinguishing factor in Dune is they have these deployment tokens, which are hidden. A deployment token will have one or two units on it, but you won't know what it is, and it's hidden. And it's only revealed when the Harkonnen forces either move into attack, or the Atreides player decides to reveal the token. It's a nice way to kind of give a bit of hidden force strength, hidden movement. It'll vary between, I think, usually 2 regulars and 2 elites. So it's a subtle distinction there. And then, of course, you've got the worm movement. You've got the Harkonnen vehicles, which facilitate that special movement, things like that. Yeah. Whereas in War of the Ring and Star Wars Rebellion, it's basically groups of units move, things like that. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about combat. The easiest combat system is War of the Ring. It's simple. You roll dice equal to a number of units. 5 or 6s usually hit, but this can be quite thematic because you play a combat card each round to add flavour. You've got your leaders, you've got your named characters who can enhance things in certain ways. It's a simple combat, but it works really well, and it creates some interesting tactics and decision making. It's never deterministic. Well, usually, close battle can be really close and comes down to the cards that are played, the thematic cards, and the decisions that players make in terms of reducing elite units and what particular combat tactics they want to play. Star Wars Rebellion, the combat in the base game is okay. Combat is divided into space and then possibly a subsequent ground battle. It's basically rolling dice, matching the attack values on your units, and then resolving hits. And you choose units to take the hits. Okay, so it's sound, it's quick, it's easy. But the expansion really adds to this via tactics, and it has a few more sort of thematic and these tactical decision-making elements that makes it so much more fun. I'd argue it makes it the most enjoyable, immersive, fun combat system of all 3. And this is why I think Rise of the Empire is an essential add-on. Dune is my least favourite of the combat systems. You roll dice, and you basically, the results on the dice are either hit, shield, or a special. Right? So every hit will cause a casualty unless it's blocked by an opposing player's shield. Okay, so the shields you roll block hits against you. Your hits cause hits unless they're blocked. The special dice are activated by leaders. So leaders, every leader will have an indication of how they can convert special results into a combination of hits and shields. Okay, so at the end of the day, you get the dice. You can roll a maximum of 6 dice. You might roll 3 hits, 2 shields, and a special. And with your special leader, you convert that special into another shield. Then you add up your hits and your shields, and you compare with what your opponent rolled. Okay, so your opponent might just roll 6 hits. So you block 3 with your shields. 3 come through to you, and you deal 3 damage to them. So 3 damage each, and you take it from your units. What I don't like about this is the fact that your special elites your characters have special combat abilities that pierce through shields, and some of your elites do special abilities where they pierce through, and it just becomes it's a simple combat system, but it just becomes kind of cumbersome to track. We kept forgetting, so you roll combat dice. It's like, okay, I've caused 3 specials there. That's 4 extra hits and 2 shields or something like that. But 2 of them pierce, so that cancels out your dice, and it just becomes a bit sort of, for a simple system, we kind of lost track of how many added bonuses. And there's no way to track this. A dial would be nice. We just like, okay, I'm going to add up that. I'm going to convert that to a hit, convert that to a shield, and then here's my final result: 7 hits, 3 shields. You cancel out 2 shields, so something like that where you can easily track it, so it's not all kind of up in your head as you're looking at all these dice and abilities and things like that. So it should be a relatively simple combat system, but it kind of becomes quite cumbersome when you've got all these special, the epic battles at the end become quite cumbersome and a bit frustrating. Okay, I want to talk also about politics and war. So all games have a degree of this politics, and obviously they're war games. So there's kind of not necessarily, well, some element of diplomacy, or Let me explain what I'm talking about. In War of the Ring, both players have to take actions to convince the nations in Middle-earth to activate and go to war. once the nation's at war, they're on your side, there's nothing more to it. But you do have to take those early steps in the game to get them to actually go to war. The other games are more dynamic in style and sort of run throughout the course of the game. So in War of the Ring, this is kind of an early first quarter, first third of the game, this happens and then you're done. In Star Wars Rebellion, players have to engage in actions to convince star systems to join their cause. And this uses a simple loyalty system to kind of simulate that. You pursue diplomatic missions to gain loyalty with these star systems, and that loyalty, once the star system is loyal, they provide you with resources to build more units. So it's really foundational to your resource production and force generation throughout the game. And it's always important, and it's changing, right? So loyalty can change. You don't want to lose that. You lose your resources. You can't build as much. I've mentioned, the Rebel Alliance is going to find themselves increasingly on the back foot as the game proceeds, as the Empire grows, takes over more systems, etc. So, ongoing theme. In Dune, there are two considerations that are quite abstractly represented. First, the Harkonnen have spice issues. The spice must flow. They must provide spice. If they fail, they must maintain the goodwill of the Imperium stakeholders by giving them spice. If they fail to provide the spice, the Spacing Guild, the Landsra, the Com get upset and imposes penalties, and they get fewer actions per turn. This is really interesting. There's quite a few moving pieces going on here. They must move out the harvesters onto the map. So they move physically, place harvesters, vehicles on the map. If they survive to the end of the turn, the harvesters return with spice, and they use that spice to keep the Imperium happy. If they don't get enough spice because sandworms have attacked their harvesters, or Atreides Fremen have attacked the harvesters, then the Imperium get angry, and they don't get as much support by getting fewer dice, fewer actions per turn. So there are penalties. It's really interesting. That's the main kind of element of diplomacy that I'm kind of thinking of in the game. The Atreides player also has kind of a degree of diplomacy. As they achieve more missions, as they advance their prescience markers up, new characters come to support them. So you get new bonuses to your dice actions and new characters you can actually place on the board. Okay, so in starting to bring this all together, they're all cinematic, thematic, immersive, epic games going for about 3 hours, featuring asymmetric player powers, a strong military power, and a kind of weaker underdog trying to achieve missions or a mission or goals, objectives. Both games will really revolve around force management, careful force management. You've got the big military power who can just throw forces into the war. You've got the underdog who needs to be more careful and often evading fighting because they don't have the same resources to support this limited, finite force strengths. Both games are a race against time, and that creates this immense tension that runs throughout the game. Often the final few turns of all these games are really tense. I have had War of the Ring, Star Wars Rebellion, Dune, ending on cliffhangers so often. So often. I love the cliffhanger endings, where it's like it could have gone one way or the other in all three games, on the final turn. And I love that feeling, that tension. Huge thematic flavour. And they're all fun. They are all so much fun to play. As I said, I if I had to pick one, I probably wouldn't because they're all so good. I personally own War of the Ring, and friends own Star Wars Rebellion and Dune War for Arrakis, but that's simply because they bought it before I could buy it. Right? If they didn't have it, I would certainly be buying all three. Now, I do want to briefly, as a postscript, talk about the expansions. Now, there are expansions for all three games. I've mentioned Star Wars Rise of the Empire. It's the only expansion for Star Wars Rebellion, and I would say it's an absolutely must-have. If you have Star Wars Rebellion, you must get Rise of the Empire, okay? It's kind of an essential mechanical revision. I haven't played with any of the Dune expansions, so I really can't comment. There's a Smugglers expansion. I think is it called a Spice expansion? Haven't played it, can't comment on it. It adds new miniatures, new rules, I think, for the factions. And I've done a completely separate video on the War of the Ring expansions. They add, right, so these expansions add new gameplay elements, right? Entirely distinct new mechanics, and it adds. So it's definitely a game enhancement. Okay, it doesn't really, I'm trying to think, it doesn't really, it revises a few little rules, but the new expansions all pretty much add to your game experience. All right, folks, there you go. That's my game comparison of those three games. I really hope this has been of value. Let me know if you've got any questions, and thanks for watching. Take care, everyone.